the black water of Caddo Lake, a dark shape, nearly 20 feet long, made a conscious decision. It turned. It began to move like a torpedo, pushing a wave ahead of it, aimed directly at the small aluminum boat. The impact was immediate, a violent force that flipped the craft over, spilling the entire family into the water. This wasn't an accident. It was an attack. To understand what hunted the McLeod family in that water, we have to go back to the beginning of that day in the spring of 1969. Thomas McLeod, an experienced fisherman, had navigated his family deep into the labyrinthine waterways of Caddo Lake, Texas. A flooded forest, an endless maze of cypress trees growing from the black surface. Seeking a quiet spot, he found a secluded bay, tied his boat securely to a tree, and cut the engine. In the sudden, oppressive quiet that followed, they were utterly alone. It was in that profound silence that the surface of the water broke, not with a splash, but with a quiet, deliberate rising. Thomas McLeod noticed it first, a huge, dark shape pushing up out of the black water, 18, maybe 20 feet long, he would later estimate. His mind reached for the ordinary. A sunken boat, he told himself, finally shifting free. The length fit, but as it surfaced, it stayed a single, featureless bar of shadow. According to his later account, this was when he stopped staring at the thing and checked the water around it. Caddo's slow drift will carry anything loose along. The ripples slid past, but the dark shape did not. It just lay there. His wife leaned forward, fingers tightening on the gunwale. "Is that a boat?" she whispered. "Just one piece," he said. A log, then a waterlogged tree letting go of the bottom until he saw the ends. Too even. Trees taper. They kept reaching for names. Gator, she tried. It would have been a legend at that size, but the outline was wrong. No clear head, no tail ridges. An alligator gar crossed his mind. Gars roll, they don't just lie flat. A manatee surfaced as a thought and vanished. Not here, not in Caddo Lake. Each explanation broke against the same fact. The thing was holding its place against the pull of the water. In Thomas's memory, the change came quietly. The object moved, not with the current, but against it. It turned, a slow, deliberate pivot in the water. As it rotated, he caught the first hint of texture, rough, uneven, what he would later describe as like armored plating or thick old scales. Then it began to come toward them. First inches, then feet, closing the gap to their small boat in a straight, steady line. He remembers his hand locking around the seat edge, forearm burning with the effort, and his wife's free hand frozen halfway to her mouth, fingers trembling in the quiet. They stopped speaking. The only sound was their breathing as the thing in the water kept advancing. Later, Thomas would say that, at that point, the question of what it was simply fell away, replaced by a single unwelcome thought. It knows we're here, and it's coming toward us. Later, when Thomas McLeod tried to explain that night on Caddo Lake in 1969, he always came back to the instant the behavior changed. The slow, almost testing passes stopped. The dark shape in the water turned, gathered speed, and in a sudden surge of spray drove straight at their small aluminum boat. Whatever shy distance it had kept before was gone. This was an attack. According to his statement, his hands went first to the rope he had just looped around the cypress knee. The line was drawn so tight toward the oncoming mass that it hummed under his grip. He braced his feet and pulled at the knot, wet fibers cutting into his fingers. His breathing turned to short, loud bursts. Each time his hand slipped, skin scraped along the rope. The knot did not give at all. When it was clear nothing would loosen that knot, he let the rope go and lunged for the motor. He grabbed the pull cord and yanked. The engine coughed once, a brief choking burst that vanished under the rush of water. As he would later recall, he pulled a second time, Harder, the cord snapping back against his hand. The motor gave a higher, strained whine, stuttered in 2 dry pops, and fell silent. Whatever chance they had to outrun the wake was gone. Then the impact hit. There was a crunch of metal from just off the stern, a sound too heavy for a 12-foot boat. The thing, estimated in later reports at 18 to 20 feet long, slammed into the aluminum hull at speed. For a heartbeat, the frame shuddered, rivets shrieking as if the boat itself cried out. The next moment, the world upended. The bow rose, the floor vanished, and they were pitched sideways into the cold water of Caddo Lake. The roar of the hit snapped into a dull underwater boom, then the fizz of bubbles. Thomas surfaced first, dragging in a breath as the cold closed around his chest. His wife came up beside him, coughing lake water, reaching until her hand locked on his arm. In the faint light, they saw the underside of the boat rocking above them. They kicked to it, palms sliding on the aluminum as they scrambled onto the overturned hull, the boat wobbling under their weight. Beneath that sheet was only black water and the unseen body that had just hit them. Somewhere in that same darkness were the alligators that hunted these channels. They lay flat, fingers hooked over the keel, legs drawn tight against the hull, so their feet would not drift below the surface, listening for any sound in the water around them. Miles away, hours before the sun would rise, a lone hunter sat in the quiet cab of his truck, checking his gear under the dim dome light. Outside, the air was still. The tree line, a dark, unbroken wall, a piece he knew well before the first birds and the first shots of the morning. That calm was a tool. According to his later account, Mark slipped out of the cab and eased the truck door shut before it could click. He moved into the tree line as part of the silence, feeling cold leaf mold under his boots and damp air on his face. It was October 1994, near Paint Creek, West Virginia. A walk he'd done so often it no longer required thought. He was an experienced bow hunter. This was his routine. He reached his chosen tree and climbed. 20 feet up, a metal platform waited, the stand he'd fixed there. Mark settled, checked the strap at his waist, and laid his bow across his lap. As he would later describe it, his job was simple. Sit in the dark, long before dawn, let the woods forget him, and wait for a deer on the trail below. The woods around him began to shift, turning that dark, milky gray before dawn. From the stand, the ground was only shapes, a pale line where the trail ran, trunks and brush fading into one wall of shadow. He could hear more than he could see. Out of that quiet came a sharp crack. A twig snapped under weight. Too heavy for a squirrel, too clumsy for a deer, in Mark's experience. His attention tightened. Seconds later, a pattern rose out of the darkness, a steady, rhythmic cadence moving through the trees. Thump, 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 thump. According to his account, it was immediately the sound of something on 2 legs, pacing just beyond his sight. His first reaction, he would later emphasize, wasn't fear, but irritation. In his mind, some other hunter, careless and loud, was tromping straight through his spot, down the same trail he expected the morning's first deer. All that patience and quiet, wasted by an amateur. Framed that way, as just an inconsiderate person, the thought kept any real unease down. The footsteps kept coming. Mark leaned forward on the metal seat, bow across his knees, eyes fixed on the band of gray between the trunks, waiting to see the fool he was sure would step out of the shadows. The milky gray light of early dawn filtered through the canopy. Through that haze he saw it at the edge of the clearing. Not a person, just a large, dark shape, his shoulders unknotted. A stump, he told himself, the same one he'd used as a landmark all season. The footsteps had to be a deer already gone. He eased back against the trunk, eyes resting on the stump as the forest slowly brightened, and the faint wash of highway traffic rose and fell in the background. Even when he forced his eyes across the rest of the clearing, they slid back to that spot. The outline was familiar, but up close the surface didn't behave like wood. He raised the binoculars and thumbed the focus ring. The stump didn't resolve into bark. It was a mass of dark, matted strands clumped with dirt and beaded with dew. His fingers tightened on the binoculars. "It's that stump," he told himself. "It's always been that stump. The light's messing with me." Yet each small adjustment only brought back the same impossible texture, until he realized he'd been holding his breath. And then the stump stood up. It didn't jerk or scramble. The mass began to rise, smooth and silent. It didn't brace with arms or rock onto its hind legs like a bear. It just unfolded. First a low crouch, then taller, and taller still. Every inch of it coming up in one unbroken line. Mark's chest locked. The air he'd meant to exhale stayed trapped halfway out, and his fingers clenched so hard around the cold aluminum of his bow that his knuckles lost all color. It stopped rising when it towered over the clearing, nearly 8 feet tall by his later estimate. Not a stump, not a bear. A massive, upright figure on 2 legs, with shoulders that seemed too broad for its height. For a moment the clearing felt thinned out, and Mark could hear his own breathing over the faint wash of the highway. 20 feet up in the stand, he felt suddenly exposed. He tried to force it into something familiar, but later, he would say, there was simply nothing he knew to call what he was looking at. What it did next unsettled him even more than the way it rose. The creature shifted its weight, leaned one thick shoulder against a nearby tree, and turned its head. Not toward Mark, but toward the sound of traffic beyond the timber, standing there like a person on a porch, watching the distant cars slide past. For a full minute, it just stood there, leaning against a thick oak, as if it were waiting for a bus. A silent, colossal figure watching the distant flow of traffic on Interstate 77. From his perch 60 yards away, Mark was paralyzed. Every instinct, every fiber of his being was screaming, but his body wouldn't respond. He was just a statue, holding his breath, watching this impossible thing. Contemplate. The whole scene was so quiet, so strangely peaceful. It felt like a dream. But the cold reality came when the creature was done watching the cars. It pushed itself off the tree and began to turn its head, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a sudden, animalistic jerk. It was a smooth, fluid motion, scanning the woods. Mark's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent forest. He felt his world shrink to the space between him and that thing. The creature's head continued its slow pan, past his position, and then it stopped and snapped back. Its gaze locked directly onto the tree stand, directly onto him. Time ceased to exist. It was no longer a shape in the woods. It was a face. According to Mark, it was flat, like a human's, but possessed a deeply primitive look that defied all classification. In that moment of eye contact, a horrifying truth was communicated without a sound. This wasn't the vacant stare of a bear or a deer. It was a look of recognition, of intelligence. The thought that seared itself into Mark's mind was no longer, "What is that?" It was, "It sees me. It knows I am here." He was no longer the observer. He was the observed. He was prey. Those few seconds stretched into an eternity of pure, psychological violation. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The creature broke eye contact. It simply turned its massive frame and, with that same unnerving calmness, walked back into the dense shadows of the forest and disappeared. It didn't run. It just left. Mark stayed in that tree stand for 20 minutes, completely frozen, unable to process what had happened. He was gripped by a fear so profound, It felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. That encounter left a scar that never faded. It's a specific kind of trauma documented in witnesses of these close encounters. A persistent, reality-questioning fear. The terror wasn't that he saw something that shouldn't exist. The terror was that the thing that shouldn't exist saw him back. And sometimes, the impossible doesn't wait for you in the deep woods. Sometimes, it finds you in the most ordinary places. On a lonely road, late at night, on the long drive home from work. Our final account takes us to a specific place and time. A lonely road in Fairborn, Ohio, in the hard winter dark of February 1991. The stretch of asphalt runs along the outskirts of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, a name that, in many accounts, is closely tied to stories of the unexplained. An unnamed man is driving home. Outside, the fields are frozen and empty. Inside the car, the heater pushes out a thin, dry warmth that leaves a faint mist along the lower edge of the windshield. The engine hums a low, steady note. The dashboard throws a soft, green glow over his hands on the wheel. Ahead of him, the white lane lines lift into the headlights and slip back into blackness again. A slow, hypnotic pulse. It's a route he has taken 100 times, the kind of drive his body does on its own while his mind drifts. Which is why the change is so jarring when something new appears, in that narrow tunnel of light. There, on the shoulder of the road, a figure stands just inside the edge of his beams, just standing. No car pulled over, no house lights in either direction, no sidewalk, no path, only frozen gravel and a shallow ditch where no one has any reason to linger at this hour. His first reaction isn't fear, it's irritation. What is some idiot doing out here in the middle of the night? As the car draws closer, the shape begins to resolve. It looks like a person, but wrapped head to toe in a tight gray suit. Fabric clinging smooth to arms and legs. On the head sits an oversized, featureless helmet, round and polished, swallowing any hint of a face. His thoughts start reaching for ordinary boxes to put this into. A prank, maybe. Some college kid from town trying to scare drivers. Or a jogger in the strangest reflective outfit he's ever seen. The helmet could be motorcycle gear, he tells himself. Or part of a costume. With the base nearby, maybe it's some kind of training suit. Someone dropped off or waiting for a pickup. Each possibility feels neat, contained. A way to keep the scene comfortably mundane. Without really deciding to, he eases his foot off the gas. The car slows to a crawl, tires whispering on the cold pavement, and he leans forward over the wheel, squinting past the faint fog on the glass to get a better look. At this distance, he expects simple, human reactions. A flinch, a turn of the head, a step back from the shoulder as the car approaches. Instead, what he sees, or doesn't see, in the figure's movement, makes his fingers tighten on the steering wheel. For a heartbeat, the way its body relates to the motion of his car refuses to match anything he recognizes, and the explanations he's been building around it begin to quietly come apart. What dissolved that explanation was not its shape, but its motion. The figure stepped from the side of the road onto the pavement. Only, it didn't step. Its legs stayed straight, and yet the whole gray body slid forward, smooth and level, as if some invisible track were carrying it toward the car. For a moment, he forced it into the only box that felt safe. A prank. Someone in a suit, maybe on wheels, some hidden rig that would make sense of the glide if he could see it. The figure kept coming. Straight, unwavering, until it reached the center of his lane and stopped. The car's high beams locked onto it. White light washed over the gray form, pinning it in the middle of the asphalt. The engine idled, a low vibration through the steering wheel. Beyond that cone of light, empty road, black night. Inside the cabin, there was only him. the faint hum of the dash, and that thing standing a car length away. Then, very slowly, with a kind of mechanical care, it turned its head toward him. His world narrowed to that rotation. His hand stayed clamped on the wheel. His foot drifted off the gas and hovered, useless, above the pedal. The engine sound thinned to background. Every part of him waited for its gaze. In that stillness, the suit illusion finally broke. He could see the surface clearly now. It wasn't fabric stretched over padding. It was skin. A smooth sheath from neck to ankle, with no seams, no cuffs, nothing to suggest clothing. Just a dull gray sheen. In his words, it looked like wet gray leather. What he'd taken for a helmet resolved into a head, huge and bulbous, a pear-shaped skull that swelled wide at the top and tapered to a tiny, almost absent chin. No jawline, no ears, none of the familiar landmarks his brain expected on a face. Set into that impossible skull were the eyes. Two black ovals, larger than they had any right to be, that seemed to swallow the headlights instead of reflecting them. Not angry, not curious, just there. Flat, depthless, like openings onto a lightless space. According to his account, this was the instant when the last scaffolding gave way. No zipper to picture, no visor line to explain those eyes, no sense of a person hiding inside. A few yards away, he believed he was looking at a 7-foot-tall figure that did not fit anywhere in his understanding of human. Time didn't stop, but it no longer felt like his. His breathing went shallow, his shoulders creeping up toward his ears. He had the fixed belief that if he moved even slightly, those black eyes would move with him. So put yourself there, alone on that stretch of road, hands locked around the wheel, headlights bleaching the color out of everything. A gray, pear-headed figure standing dead center in your lane, turned fully toward you. Your brain insists it cannot exist, but it's right there against the glass. In that moment, what do your hands and feet do? And after it's gone, how do you convince yourself the world is still the same? For the driver on that lonely Ohio road, the answer was instinct, not thought. The paralysis broke, and his foot slammed onto the accelerator. The car leapt forward, the speedometer edging toward 90. In that moment, all that mattered was distance, more road between himself and whatever had slipped across his headlights. Back inside his house, his movements turned methodical. Lock the front door, set the deadbolt, check each window twice. In a study of people who reported close encounters involving gray-skinned humanoid figures, Clancy et al. Described a pattern. Fear in the moment. A collapse in the sense that the world is predictable. Then hypervigilance, locking doors, checking windows, and finally, withdrawal. Locked door isolation. His circuit through the darkened house is the beginning of that same pattern. He did not disappear into silence. The next day, he forced himself to write down what he had seen and submitted it to the Mutual UFO Network as an official report. His encounter on that dark road near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base became MUFON Case File 188, a private nightmare translated into a case number and a short narrative preserved in an archive. Case File 188 is not alone. The overturned boat on Caddo Lake sits in a brief local newspaper entry. Mark's encounter in the Pines is logged in the BFRO database, and this Ohio driver's night on the road is stored in MUFON's catalog under that simple label, 188. Picture them together for a moment. The article about the capsized boat, Mark's statement, the MUFON entry describing a shape that crossed the road in a way nothing familiar does. On paper, they look tidy. Dates, locations, brief descriptions. What the records cannot hold is the aftermath, the way a quiet drive or a foggy lake never feels simple again. Clancy et al. Argue that this is the real mark these encounters leave behind. Not just fear, but a lasting sense that reality has seams, and that something has already slipped through them once. So when these accounts end up in a newspaper archive, a BFRO report, or a MUFON case file, they are not just campfire stories. They are testimonies from ordinary, credible people whose sense of the world was broken and then fixed in place as part of the record. Have you ever had a moment that made you question what is real? Something small that still lingers in your mind? If you are willing, share it in the comments below.